Good evening, everyone. We were saying the good and bad of having the chai beforehand is that there's a really nice atmosphere of camaraderie, but getting everyone inside is the challenge. So, thank you everyone for coming out tonight. I know this is a topic that's hard to think about right now when it's like 7 degrees outside, but we're extremely happy to have Professor Rajan Rawal here. We've been working on a climate change project at the Mitchell Institute for the last year and a half. And we had several faculty go to Ahmedabad last year and had the great honor of having Professor Rawal host us at his lab. And his team really just take very good care of us while we were in Ahmedabad. So we're very happy to have you here and to hopefully return the favor. And so tonight, obviously, we'll be talking about heat. Professor Rahul Mehrotra will be our moderator for the evening. Many of you, I'm sure, know Professor Rahul Mehrotra, but I will just do a brief introduction. Rahul Mehrotra is the founder, principal of RMA Architects. He divides his time between working in Mumbai and Boston, and teaching at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University, where he is Professor of Urban Design and Planning and John T. Dunlop Professor in Housing and Urbanization. And he is our go-to for all things Mumbai urban and has done so many amazing things with us at the Mitchell Institute. And I will hand it over to him to moderate for this session. Thank you.
Thanks, Colin, and thank you all for you've left your keys here in case you need them. Yes. No, thank you very much, and I'm really delighted that we're having this discussion, both for Rajan for being here, taking the time, and spending it, and again, everyone's thanked you, but for the great hospitality you provided for the team. They was very welcoming, and I think it made a huge difference when they were in Ahmedabad. And Gary, thank you for participating in this. You know, I sort of had become a climate change skeptic because every conference I went to on climate change, I found they were just describing the problem in more complex terms. The graphics were getting more animated, and therefore it was a description and a redescription, which of course has some value. But at some point I felt, my God, I can't do any more of these. And when Sachit sort of invited me to Delhi, that was a real game changer. I thought that was one of the most sort of wonderfully intellectually structured conferences. And I think for me, what I got really out of it, which was inspirational, was the way you broke it down into domains like livelihoods and public health and built form. And I think Rajan and I were on a panel, and it was really productive because we could actually address granular sort of conditions, which then create interesting feedback loops to even understand climate change much more broadly. And so that was really a wonderful conversation. And Rajan, I remember taking away a lot from that, and Sachit and others who were involved in structuring it. Thank you very much. So today, I think it's partly an extension of that conversation when we're getting two experts sort of providing us different perspectives, completely different climatic zones, completely different geographic, economic conditions. And so I think it could become a really, I think it will potentially be a really interesting conversation. So the way we'll structure this is we'll start with a presentation by Rajan, followed by Gary, and then we'll take questions and hopefully have a discussion to try to extract from it things that could be useful. So Rajan Rawal he's a professor at CEPT University and a senior advisor at the Center for Advanced Research in Building Science and Energy. And really, I must say, I'm an alum of CEPT. I go and do things there, and what Rajan has managed to do within that institution in setting up this center is absolutely remarkable, and I think incomparable in India, because what he's achieved, both in kinds of the fundings that he's garnered, but the team he's put together and the research projects they have designed is absolutely amazing. And his research explores passive and active design strategies, urban microclimates, embodied carbon, and adaptive thermal comfort models. And I think his belief of nestling scales in understanding the problem and not isolating it only to the building, but finding ways that one can actually read the context and beyond in informing the way that we think about passive design is really an amazing contribution. He also led the Indo-US Joint Energy R&D Center, Building Energy Efficient Sector, and the Indo-UK Project on Energy Demand Reduction between 2012 and 2020. He's played a pivotal role in the Global Cooling Prize, an innovation competition that developed a climate-friendly residential cooling solution that can provide cooling for all without warming the planet. And he serves on all sorts of boards, nationally as well as internationally. And he became the first, in 2021, he became the first Indian architect to be honored as a fellow of both the American Society of Heating, Refrigeration and Air Conditioning Engineers and the International Building Performance Simulation Association. So Rajan has really not only been an institutional builder, but he has also quite successfully bridged the technology involved in these questions, but also his own training skill with spatial imaginaries as an architect. So thank you again, Rajan, for being here. Gary Adamkovich, and I'll call him Gary because it's a hard one to pronounce, is an associate professor of environmental health and exposure disparities at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, where he leads the Healthy Cities Lab. Gary is also the director of the Harvard Urban Health Initiative, a program based at the Bloomberg Center for Cities, which seeks to engage with mayors and senior city officials on urban health issues to identify evidence-based practices to address these challenges. He brings more than 25 years of research and practice experience on the connections between housing, neighborhoods, and health to these challenges, on understanding disparities in environmental exposure and health within cities. So it's interesting that both his interests and Rajan's interests, which is the way I see as nestling scales to understand the problem, not situating the reading or the solutions only at the unit of the building, but also nestling it within the larger environments, whether it's neighborhoods, cities more broadly, and trying to create methodologies to do that, albeit in completely different contexts, I think is a wonderful common ground. His healthy public housing work has been recognized by the US Secretary of Housing and Urban Development with a national award in 2016. He's also served as an advisor to the World Health Organization's efforts to establish indoor air quality guidelines, and holds a PhD in chemical engineering from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and a Master of Public Health at Harvard. And so again, this is an interesting combination of concerns, issues, and bridges, in a sense, between disciplines in both the cases of our speakers. So very much look forward to hearing you both and the discussion that will follow. So Rajan, thank you.
Namaskar. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for making me really, really comfortable with the chai and samosa, even in the -2 degrees centigrade here. Thank you very much for having me here. I'll spend some time giving you a little bit of understanding what has happened in India in terms of buildings and architecture, and then what is the current state, and some of the thoughts which we are having, that how much can we do and when can we do and who can do this kind of work, and then probably Gary will take it over. Historically, in India, we call it buildings, clothes, or what you can wear, and food were the basic necessity. And in the last 70 years, we have reasonably managed that pretty well, especially in the last couple of decades. While we have managed that, suddenly we have started seeing some other challenges. And one of them, it's generally not very visible on the screens or not in the media, but it's very much visible in the daily life. That's heat. Not as much as other climate change extremes, but the way heat has really, really penetrated in our daily life, and especially where the building sector has also played a little bit of negative role in bringing the heat really into our daily life, is where probably I thought that we need to focus a little bit more currently and in the future, and not just about the design of the built form environment, but also design and operation of buildings and the cities. Before I move to my main topic, I thought that let me give you a little bit of background, and I probably believe there are a few architects here who has a little bit of understanding about what has happened in India. At the same time, few who might not have very much aware about what has happened in India in terms of buildings. And the 5 pictures or 5 illustrations which I'm putting it here is post 1930 or 1935, just before independence. Britishers started building in New Delhi, and an architect, Sir Edwin Luton, started building buildings, and the kind of response he gave it to the climate was predominantly, I would say, real manifestation of solar radiation. So position of the sun in India and how radiation falls and how building gets designed, whether it is overhangs or little of trellis. And all of that got manifested in a stone, and that's what you see probably one of the early response in India, apart from what has happened in the past. So that was a response from Sir Lutyens. And then in 60s, 70s, and 80s, many architects started dealing with this. But one of the example which I'm showing you here is a house where an architect, Charles Correa, specifically managed two things of thermodynamics, which is radiation and convection. And that particular house has 2 sections, which is, we call it a summer section and winter section. So in one area you live during the winter, and another area you live during the summertime, and it manages the convection part or the wind very well. So a little bit of more complexity has gone into the buildings. People have become a little bit more conscious, not just about solar radiation, which is very physical thing to manifest in a brick and mortar, but convection also. That means basically somebody has started dealing with the volumes and dealing with the stack effect and so on and so forth. But come 1980, 1990, the CMC building in Mumbai, designed by Vinod Gupta, that was one of the first building where you see suddenly the glass has started appearing. And Professor Gupta, why we call it Professor Gupta, although he did PhD on this building and started managing the louvers and controls, but being a practicing architect, he did a lot of work which all of us as an academics also refer as a very much academic work. So Dr. Gupta managed to bring the CMC building. At that time it was called CMC. It was a company, and it had all the IT related stuff getting into the building. That means louvers were automated, glass was double glazed, and also some kind of sensing mechanism and so on and so forth. So this to us, to my generation, that's one time where buildings has started getting a little bit more than just a brick and mortar. Some kind of electronics has started coming in, some kind of sensing requirement has started coming in. And then in 2003 onwards, we have seen a whole lot of green building rating programs, voluntary rating programs has started coming in. And they started bringing, we call it elements or products, which are sort of ready to install off the shelf. And these are not, I'm not mentioning the HVAC systems, which are generally off the shelf and you fix, but these are we call it something get attached with the buildings, whether it's a louvers, vertical louvers. There are few companies in India has started making them very effective, whether it's the turbine fans, in popularly called, it's a basically self-extracting mechanism, doesn't use any energy, or a little bit of evaporative cooling systems. These have started coming in the market. Even if your building does not have a passive strategy installed, you can buy them, put it on your building, and you can start dealing with the harsher climate outside. So that's how the complexity of buildings have started getting more into the area. And then while we do that, so this is what basically I explained, that yes, somebody was dealing with the sun and radiation. In fact, in a modern architecture, even Corbusier had dealt with the sun very well, sun and wind, which is basically radiation and convection, and then radiation, convection, and conduction, and all kind of IT systems have started coming in. However, then onwards, the liberalized economy has started giving us something where you cannot really make it any visual difference, whether it is 0 degree north or 50 degree north. And you can see probably Delhi buildings are very, very similar to kind of buildings which you see in the rest of the world. So that's a time where homogenization of aesthetics has started happening. And the shift happened towards, we call it a tech fix. The architects have started leaving the decisions or making buildings comfortable to the engineers. Most of the time it happens that we will design it in ABCD manner and probably somebody will make it comfortable, somebody will make it stand. So structural engineers also started taking a little bit more responsibility. And that's where things have started changing. While we have recognized that, parallelly we also started understanding that some of the buildings which was originally been made keeping the climate in the focus, they did not serve as per their original intent. So I'm giving it probably 3 examples here. One is IIM Ahmedabad, second is IRMA, and that is in Anand, and third is again Atira building in Ahmedabad. This is basically a piece of modern architecture. If you look at the plan section elevations, you will see that there is a very clear-cut response to the hot and dry climate or composite climate. That means you have thick walls, smaller windows, bit of courtyards here and there. However, these buildings did not give enough thermal comfort to the occupants, primarily because of the landscape. So this is where the disconnect started happening. The buildings were made and constructed keeping in mind the climate, but probably microclimate was not conducive enough for those buildings to remain in hot and dry climate, and it started making the huge difference in terms of vegetation, and the humidity has started going up, trans evaporation rates has started going up, and buildings did not really function the way they were designed. So this is what has happened in 2000, I would say, from 1960 to 2015, 20. And then we started getting some kind of policy intervention or policy documents from a federal government, from the central government. One of the key document which we keep referring to most of the time is Cooling Action Plan. Probably India was one of the first country which recognized that we need to have some kind of document which deals with the cooling in the country. And this is, I was part of some of these, and we deliberated that whether it should be a cooling or it should be a comfort or it should be a thermal comfort. Primarily, it boiled down to cooling because we are not just looking at the human beings, but we are also looking at the food chain, cold chain, and so on and so forth. So hence, the action plan was dealing with the largely a cooling. And then we got Energy Conservation Building Code, couple of versions of that. Most of the large cities have started preparing their own climate action plans. Heat action plan, that's another document. I think now we have about 70 cities or 72 cities who have their own heat action plan. Basically, these action plans is helping city government dealing with the heat waves. They talk about how do you really deal with the early warning systems, what are the things which you do during the heat waves in your city. They really do not deal with a planning purpose or planning document, but they do provide an immediate guidance that during the heat wave, what you should be doing, not really the mitigation part of that. And also some of the documents which started talking about integration of nature-based solutions in the cities and so on and so forth. While we got that policy documents, some of the green building rating programs also provided us, I would say, reasonable understanding and access to products. So markets has started flooding up with not just about products, but also consulting services. There are a whole lot of consultants are available to help you out with the buildings or city planning and so on and so forth. But that also gave us some break somewhere that the moment you start planting tree, people started, we have done what we're supposed to do. That has given us some kind of false sense of accomplishment. Also, sometimes people said, ABCD building in the past had XYZ elements, and I have put that element in my building, that means my building is going to be climate responsive, or that building is going to be positive towards the environment, and person will receive a thermal comfort, and so on and so forth. So what has happened with a whole lot of guidebooks and lot of, I would say, suite of solutions, people have started not taking the first principles into the account. Without understanding what context one needs to do what. Elements of the buildings, elements of the cities has started getting transplanted from one context to other place, and that people have started looking at, oh, we have designed it in X manner, and then they leave it to the operators to operate in a whichever manner they want. So this is a sort of situation we are in, where many professionals have a false sense of accomplishment, sometimes because they have mimicked the past, sometimes they have done something in terms of tech fix, and they feel that they have done what they're supposed to do, not looking at how buildings getting operated even after 2 years, 3 years, or 5 years. While we have started focusing more and more on heat, the another component, which is humidity, we have not really dealt with very well. And this is where the topic, the difference or between heat stress and a thermal comfort comes. When we're discussing about what should be the title, and we came up this title. The title says that between heat stress and thermal comfort, or between comfort and heat stress. And what we believe is that uncomfortable situation does not mean that you are under stress, but at the same time, comfortable situation does not mean that you are not under heat stress. Sometimes physiologically you might be comfortable, but psychologically you might be under stress, or other way around, that you are comfortable or you are uncomfortable, but you may not be under heat stress. And this is where humidity starts playing a role. And that's where some of the work which we are doing with some of the colleagues here have started focusing, that how do we really look at the humidity as a part of the game. And my strong belief is that buildings really can deal with the temperature plus minus some ways, but to deal with the humidity and a building as an entity, building as a system, it is a lot of limitation when it comes to dealing with the humidity. And probably I can explain that in a while. Can building really provide us a thermal comfort? And with all passive strategies, and I'm not using word passive cooling strategies because I have some reservation towards the passive cooling terminology, and I believe that passively you can't cool anything. You can cool only with the active system. What you can do is you can delay, or you can probably reduce, but you can't really cool. So all kind of passive strategies which we are doing, can building give us a comfort, not even a heat stress. And this is the chart which tells you that in Ahmedabad, if you design your building with all passive strategies, probably in the center 36% hours of the year, you can achieve that through buildings. The rest of the time, you will require either dehumidification or humidification or active cooling, or sometimes heating as well. And what you see here, the two bands, is basically they are a lower band of the adaptive model and upper band of the adaptive model. That means our sensation keeps varying between summer and winter, depending upon what the outdoor conditions are. Humidity, again, I'm focusing a little bit more on this. In October 24, during the air show in Chennai, people lost their life. They were hydrated, they were having a protection from sun, but wet bulb temperature, the relative humidity was so high that they could not simply keep pace with that, and they lost their life. So again, buildings do need to deal with the humidity over a period of time, and that's where the focus is. Another challenge which we have started getting is we are losing the shoulder periods. Typically, largely in India, we get sort of starting of the winter around October and ending of a winter around February, and then March would be a time where we will have a shoulder period, and April 15th onwards, you will start getting things starting warmer. Historic data suggests that the shoulder period, both March, April, and September, October after monsoon, is reducing. The way we see this, that in Ahmedabad and also in Chennai and Jaipur, to reach 10-degree delta used to happen over 45 days. So if I am at 35-degree average temperature, it will take about 35-40 days to reach to 45-degree average temperature. That has started reducing to about 15 days. That means one point in time we are using or we are closing our windows. We might not be using heaters, but we might be having the warmer clothes. And next week we might start using air conditioners. That's a kind of change which we have started looking at. And this is where, again, stress starts coming in, because thermal comfort has has a correlation with what happens outdoors. And your sensation always depends upon, if outdoor is low, you would like to have a lower temperature inside. If outdoor is high, you would like to have a higher temperature inside, relatively higher temperature inside. But when you lose the shoulder period, suddenly your body starts getting a stress and it doesn't know how to adjust that part. This is another challenge, and I feel that, or I believe that passive strategies are not the solution to deal with this shoulder period or reduction of this shoulder period. Rob is here and Sachin's group. We are working in Ahmedabad, and what we have observed is that buildings are not really sometimes some kind of buildings are not really the one which are providing us a comfort. So what you're seeing here is the black line is outdoor temperature, mean outdoor temperature, and all those houses, and especially in affordable housing segments, they are warmer than outdoors, primarily because of the kind of construction we have and so on and so forth. Another area, not just about building, and that's where I also believe that we need to deal with the urban heat. If all the cooling strategies needs to work, or all the passive strategies needs to work, we really need to make sure that our larger setting does provide similar kind of situation for it to operate. In the past, we have seen, in a lot of papers you might see, our argument, you'll see that old historic precincts. In Ahmedabad, we call it pole houses. In Maharashtra, they call it Wada. Or in Lucknow, they call it Havelis or Kothis. They used to work, they used to provide a thermal comfort because the larger urban setting was not that warm. Now, the cities have grown, urban settings are warmer, and that's where these historical buildings or the vernacular buildings are not the one who can provide us thermal comfort. Typically, what we have seen in India is that nights are warmer and days are warmer. And this is where most of the time I try to explain to people that I have no problem if my heartbeat goes up to 145, 150, provided I can take it back to a 90 level in few minutes. But if it remains at 120 BPM consistently, then there is a problem. And that's what is happening in India, that nights are remaining warmer and warmer. We don't get a chance to cool down the nights. We have a developmental problem. We have to have developmental goals. We have to have climate goals. And this is where we have started balancing out. We need more floor space for sure. Our cities needs to become a denser for sure. But how do you make these buildings or cities more denser without compromising on nighttime radiation, or nighttime deep radiation is what the challenge is. And I think this is a design challenge, more design challenge than a technology challenge. The moment you start seeing the sky, obviously you will be able to re-radiate back. Right now, our buildings, our cities, our streets don't see the sky in the night. Kind of evidences which we have started getting is also leads us to question sometimes that does the nature-based solutions are the way to go. And some cities, definite results say that no way you can have trees in a warm and humid climate, because tree does increase the transevaporation rate, does increase the humidity immediately around the buildings, and the latent load goes up, not just a sensible load. and that also increases the cooling. The moment you start cooling, the heat rejection outside, and that you are in a downward spiral. So how do we start dealing with the passive strategies at the city scale is where we are looking at some of the solutions. This is also another example where your outdoor is lower than your indoors. This is where the building starts giving a stress. One of my interview on the newsletter does have this particular part that the primary function of the building is to provide us comfort. And when buildings do not provide a comfort, what can we do? It's basically our third skin. The way we explain that this is our first skin, that's the clothes, our second skin, and the third skin. If third skin is not helping us, we really can't manage. And that's where I would like to see the urban scale, probably the fourth skin. And if that fourth skin started helping us, probably the third skin might be useful. Our work in Chennai does suggest that some of the hotspots in Chennai does not remain the hotspots across the day. Some of them are hotspots during the daytime, some of them are, but they don't remain hotspots during the afternoon, and they don't remain hotspots during the night. And this is where the presence of vegetation, presence of water bodies also does get under scanner. That do you really need to provide deciduous trees or trees having high transevaporation rates in Chennai? Probably may not. You might require a ground cover to reduce the radiation, or you might want to see the sky when you have a concrete footpath or the pavements or parking lots. But having concrete pavements and having a tree on top, what you're doing is you're not seeing the sky and you're not re-radiating things back into the sky. That means your cities are getting warmer and warmer over a period of time. And this is where some of the solutions which we are trying to find through our research by working with the local government, hopefully we should be able to get there somewhere. This is probably one of those last slide. And as a human being, how much do we need in terms of cool our body? We need about 130 watts. If you divide that into sensible load and latent load, it might be about 35, 45, and so on and so forth. But the moment you start putting the body into the building, you need about 3,800 watts. So this is what building does to us. Now, if I have to function in that building, probably I'll require some more gadgets here and there. It will go up to probably about 4,800 watts, which is about 1.6 or 1.3 tons of refrigeration. Body requires 130. What we provide with the buildings is about 4,800. And this is where probably we need to do something so that buildings do come closer and closer to that particular part. And the last point from my side, coming from a university, I really need to think about how do we inculcate some of the culture in the students so that they start integrating this not as a separate layer or as a consulting or someone who can help them out, but from a design point of view, how do they start learning this from the day one? If there are architects in the room, they will recognize that we are being taught proportioning systems, right? How do you really design, whether it is Indian proportioning systems or coming something from modern architecture? When you start designing buildings, you do deal with numbers in terms of proportioning systems. We have, in India, we have very large and very consistent organization of students. What they do is that they keep doing a measured drawings of historic buildings or modern buildings, and there will be a good amount of archival documents available for somebody to look at how these buildings have been designed and constructed. So they do measurements. What we don't do environmental measurements of any of those buildings. We do teach how to design a structure. We do teach how to cost estimate, how much time your building will take. So all this is quantification which we teach other than the semantic part. We sometimes also teach how much energy the building will require or how much water building will require. But we don't teach how much energy building will use. So in a technical term, if I put it, we do calculate connected load, but we don't look at other side of the meter. that how much has been consumed. Not that I have 1 inch of pipe means I will get a water. How much liter of water I have consumed is more important than what's my connected load. So I think this is where the education also has started looking at that. How do we really inculcate some of these as a part of the building science or architecture education? And with that, probably I would like to end my presentation. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. First, I'd just like to thank everyone at Mittal and the organizers for the chance to be here tonight. I consider myself a recovering engineer, so it's really a thrill to be on a panel with Rajan and sort of think about all of the engineering considerations that he raised and also the contextual considerations that wrap around that. My goal in my talk is to not go deeper on the Indian context or go deeper on the engineering. What I'd like to do is sort of more broadly contextualize the way to think about addressing heat in communities and cities. I've spent the good part of the last 20 years worrying about housing in the greater Boston area, in many cities around the world, but in Boston, and I've spent a lot of time in people's living rooms trying to understand the lived experience of how people encounter environmental risk. So I'm going to start with a figure that shows average temperatures over the last 150 years in Ahmedabad to sort of build a bridge to Rajan's talk. But if we sort of travel east roughly around the world and go to Dhaka, Tokyo, Los Angeles, Boston, Reykjavik, Khartoum, Kuala Lumpur, and Auckland. Of course, we bounced around some latitudes there. So it doesn't take a data scientist to sort of see how real these trends are. And I don't think I need to convince anyone here how real climate change is. I'll plant one seed already with this, is that there is a lot of variability between these cities and how you might approach the problem. But we shouldn't forget that there are a lot of commonalities in how you think about the problem. And one, coming from the world of public health, I think health surveillance and epidemiology can also be your friends in sort of seeing where heat-related morbidity and mortality are happening. Those are real clues to what is happening behind closed doors in people's homes. It's also important to underscore the fact that we're not just talking about heat stroke, we're talking about exacerbation of a lot of conditions, and seniors can have a lot of underlying health conditions that are exacerbated by excess heat or dehydration and those sorts of things. But we're not going to spend a lot of time dealing with that. I give a lot of talks where I impress upon folks that a lot of people around the world spend 90% of their time in a room inside, whether it's work, play, school, or home. So these end up being really important microenvironments, and the word hidden was in the title of tonight's event. And in many cases, I've seen a lot of situations over the years where the risks are really hidden to public health professionals, primary care physicians, other decision makers within a city, or community activists. And more globally, we're looking at multifamily housing where units exist within buildings, exist within neighborhoods. And as you saw from the opening slide, climate change is happening. It's real. It's happening everywhere. And it is an all of the above moment. There's no such thing as a magic solution. It's not just about greening neighborhoods. And if you think about this multi-level framing, units within buildings, within neighborhoods, at each of those levels, there are things you can identify. There are solutions that can be crafted. I'm not saying it's always easy, And the physics is something we do understand, but homes are actually, in many ways, residences can be more complicated than spaces like this. Spaces like this are designed to be properly heated and ventilated. They don't have a lot of sources in this space. There are a lot of individual sources of air pollution within people's homes. There are a lot of contributors, as Rajan showed, to the thermal load within a home. So you may not be able to see all these, but these are just examples: in-home cooling, greening, public awareness, shading. More and more, we do know what some of the elements of the toolbox can be. What we need are ways of packaging that for decision makers and leaders in cities. So climate matters, structure matters, material, setting, and behavior. The other thing to recognize as a challenge is that buildings don't turn over quickly. If you think about addressing air pollution from cars, every 20 years, the car fleet sort of turns over. Buildings stay around for a very long time. So you have to both think about what you might do for the next building to be built, but climate change is going to affect everyone who's living in a building that is anywhere from 1 year to 200 years old or older. So that entire portfolio needs to be part of the consideration. I do a lot of work that focuses on a very, in the US context, low-income communities. There are field studies that are trying to understand excess heat. The Community Hats program, which I'm not an expert on, but Sachit and Rob and others here are the leaders on trying to understand the experience of extreme heat among self-employed women in Ahmedabad and beyond. There are studies that look at informal settlements where, it's not very complicated physics to know that a metal roof has more ability to heat up compared to a thatched roof, that insulation affects the time course and degree of heat being absorbed or released, that green space or shading can sort of affect these things. So and also how we use equipment. My eyes have been opened in the last few years. Some of Rob's work on the effectiveness of fan use at different temperatures. That does boil down to basic physics. And some of this has to do with just the physical structure of the building. So the materials we use will affect how these heat loads move back and forth. But I want to step back and really think about a way of anchoring everyone's thought around experiences that we know of from the past, which are certainly going to become more common. In the popular press, there are a few very globally known heat waves. The heat wave in Chicago in 1995, the Paris heat wave of 2003. There has been a lot learned, and I want to sort of use this as an example of another way at the city level we can extract information that is relevant to our response for heat waves to come while we're doing all these other things to allow people to be resilient, like cooling centers or providing cooling or using passive or active approaches. The heat wave in Chicago happened in 1995. It's been estimated that there are approximately 700 deaths. Now, the epidemiology that's been done on this heat wave is not necessarily transferable to every other situation, but just to give you a sense, when the data were analyzed, individuals were more likely to die if they had known medical problems and confined to bed. You can imagine that, but it's an odds ratio of 5.5, 5.5 times more likely if folks were unable to care for themselves. If on a typical day there was evidence that they did not typically leave the home, 6.7 times. If they lived alone, 2.3 times lived on a top floor. There were certain characteristics that were protective, having a working air conditioner, once again, not rocket science, having access to transportation. These both reduced risk by about a factor of 3. Folks who participated on a regular basis in group activities had lower risk. And just having some evidence that the individual had a circle of friends in the Chicago area. If you look at there were similar trends if you look at a lot of heat waves city to city. If you look at the evidence in Paris, there's an element of Paris's architecture that a lot of people admire, which are the metal roofs. Those are, not surprisingly, very effective at absorbing heat. So a zinc roof can achieve a temperature, in direct sun, can achieve a temperature of 140 Fahrenheit, 60 degrees Celsius. Paris is obviously not going to change all of its roofs overnight. This is the majority of buildings in the center of Paris. But once again, if you break this down into elements of the building, the design, elements of the systems that are in place, and elements of human behavior, you can start to sort of break this problem down into manageable parts. And people have sort of modeled this, and people are trying to intervene by replacing some of these roof materials to allow those roofs to be cooler. And it was found that in Paris, folks who lived on the top floor were more likely to die in the heat wave. So I want to step back again and sort of think about some more contextual thoughts I'd like to leave with you. This was a paper that came out a few years ago, which showed, I think this makes it real for a lot of us, even those who have seen all the temperature records. This shows over the next few decades how climates are going to shift over time. So the city of Portland on the west coast, northern west coast of the United States will, in the next few decades, have the climate of Fresno. Los Angeles climate will effectively become the climate of Baja California. Tampa will have a climate that looks more like Mexico. You could do this in many places around the world. And once again, this is a train that is moving. There's no mystery around the fact that cities will have to address the repercussions of what those excess temperatures are, in addition to the extreme weather events that are happening that are maybe a little harder to predict. And so I'm going to focus the next few photos on the US. This is a photograph from the Los Angeles Times showing someone in Los Angeles sort of dealing with extreme heat, sitting out on a patio with a fan. There is no substitute if you want to address the health outcomes related to excess heat. There's no substitute for understanding daily life, daily decision making, both the buildings, the systems, but the behaviors that people are engaged in and the way people might make decisions. If you were to in this neighborhood, go to 5 different apartments that had the same design, you might find, 3 different ways people choose to cope with the heat, or 3 different ways you might describe the constraints that are in people's lives as they struggle with these situations. Other elements of climate change are happening at the same time. This is flooding in the seaport area of Boston. This is flooding on a major road in Vietnam. This is a picture of a homeless encampment in the city of Phoenix. This is an example of how other crises that are common within cities run into the challenges of climate change. Up till there's been some movement in the data in the last year because of some interventions and some great action by the city. But as of last year, about half of the heat-related deaths in Phoenix were among the homeless. And you would think that that would be a fact that would just be known to everyone. But so that's a really big fact, that it takes someone who's either a clinician or at a hospital or a data person to sort of recognize that. And that's a really big factor, 1/2 of all the deaths. So within every city are these narratives that explain why certain subpopulations are suffering. It's not complicated in the year 2026 to look at how heat-related deaths vary spatially. We have epidemiologists who do that sort of thing every day, and it's not just counting the people who have heat stroke and finding out where they are. It has to do with all these other problems that are exacerbated. I don't need to tell everyone in the room that we're now living on an urban planet. Since 2007, more of the world's inhabitants live in cities than in rural areas. Cities are on the front lines of public health, the front lines of climate change. It's not only a place to understand what's happening with health and what's happening with the environment, it's also a place where solutions can happen effectively. Local leaders need to answer to local problems. I hope that COVID was a wake-up call, that every city in the world had to deal with the nature of COVID and how it spread in their city. And it's another example where there are commonalities, but there were specifics. The way things spread in New York City was different than the ways things spread in Los Angeles or other cities. Globally, we're sitting in the Mittal space. Just in the fall, the UN announced that Tokyo is not the most populous city in the world. Jakarta is, and if you look at the projections through 2050, Dhaka and Jakarta are top on the list and exceeding 50 million. Once again, that is another train that's moving very far forward. Not all that population growth will not be protected from the effects of extreme weather, from the effects of extreme heat. If you look at 2005 and especially places that had very high heat indexes globally, and project that out to 2100, the extreme population growth in the global south, the risk for heat in the global south is an issue that the researchers in this room, as well as the decision makers around the world, need to wrestle with. I already mentioned the fact that we have a global housing affordability crisis. Housing affordability does affect environmental risk and health risk. The more unaffordable homes are, the more people live in conditions that provide more risk to their health. If you look at this figure, it shows on the x-axis the share of the population over 60 across the wet bulb globe temperature. There's no doubt that an aging population is going to feel the effects of climate change more dramatically. Also, the other thing which is unavoidable is that even though we have approaches such as passive approaches, the demand for cooling is going to put even more pressure on the climate. And if I could have one wish outside of my field or inside of my field, it would be that that we could advance the line towards more efficient cooling. That's a very tough problem. So as I close, I'll just bring you back to more local work. We have, last year we started an intervention focused on high-risk adults. These are adults over 55 who had underlying health conditions, who did not have access to air conditioning. This was one of those projects that was halted by the federal government, in news you may have read about. And so we're now hopefully back on track for this year. The reason I bring it up is, in some way it seems like a very linear, run-of-the-mill intervention just to give out air conditioners. But the more I do work that involves being in people's living rooms, working with affected communities, there's always something to learn. One thing that had came out just from last summer is how many families in Boston were not necessarily in either category. It wasn't, so there were folks who didn't have any AC, but there were a lot of folks who had some access on paper to air conditioning, but it wasn't adequate. So there are folks who might have one air conditioner in a 3-bedroom apartment. They chose to put it in the room of the person in the home who needed it the most. That might have been a child or an elder. There were folks who had very old air conditioners that they got secondhand, which were effectively blowing warm air. There are folks who, when pushed to buy an air conditioner, ended up buying a very cheap model, a model on sale that ultimately did not have enough power to cool the entire. So there's a whole community in Boston that are under-conditioned and so still don't have the means to alleviate the risks of climate change. So I'll skip this. This is just some of the details of that. And I'll leave you with, it was mentioned that I am involved now in a new initiative connected with the Bloomberg Center for Cities. It's called the Harvard Urban Health Initiative. And our goal here is really to shrink the line between the generation of actionable evidence base and the decision makers who need them. Mayors rely more on other mayors for guidance than they do on researchers. All due respect to all of us in the room. And so we're trying to think about how to create these networks of mayors, decision makers, how to curate the best evidence that's not just happening at Harvard especially, but globally. And how do you sort of get actionable models to spread and evolve over time? We're working across a few different channels to do this. We're convening, connecting, conducting research, and curating research. And I'll leave you with these last thoughts, but I'll just go to the middle. We need an all-of-the-above approach that recognizes the role of the built environment, the role of buildings, and people. It is extremely important to understand the lived experience of the populations you're trying to help. Active and passive approaches are needed. We need efficient cooling. The world will continue to acquire more cooling as we go forward. The role of human behavior is in shaping risk, and we must understand the lived experience of high-risk populations. So thank you for the chance to be here. Happy to answer any questions. Sorry if I went long. Thanks.
Thank you, Gary, and thank you, Rajan. I mean, these were both, and I can see many sort of correlations in the questions you're asking, even though your research is located in different places. So what I'm going to just do is reflect on 4 things that I sort of picked up and I found as kind of common ground, and maybe that might lead to a response from you all or a question, and then we'll open it up very quickly. So, I think the first thing that struck me, and Rajan, of course, it started with your presentation, but Gary, of course, it was implicit in yours, was the question of culture and lifestyle. I mean, you started, Rajan, with clothes and food and, all of this. Culture as those implicit rules in society. And it's interesting you referred to Charles Correa's project, and, he wrote a really seminal essay in the 60s and early 70s when they had the oil crisis and things. And at that time, in the debates about modern architecture, it was form follows function. And he wrote a very interesting essay which he called Form Follows Climate. And it was all about how actually the form of the building could be responsive, which is what you pointed out. And then the jump occurs where we're looking at mechanical and chemical fixes. But what is implicit in form follows function is lifestyle. Because in that building, for example, there was a summer section and a winter section, and that was half the house, which was more efficient in the summer, and you would spend time there, and vice versa. I mean, the courtyards in traditional architecture was about that. In the summer, you put the shade at sunrise, so the hot, cool air from the floor of the courtyard, which was cooled during the night, the air, cool air stayed in, and in the winter you reversed it. So it was ways of actually adapting lifestyle in response to climate. And we've kind of lost a sense of that because we want a lifestyle, whether it's the food we eat, it's the same through the year. Strawberries are available at any point. So we therefore have to rely on chemical and mechanical fixes. And I think you pointed out passive in itself can't work. It has to be complementary. And it gets hyper complemented when our lifestyles have to be that steady. So we have no give. It's a difficult question, and it's a culture lifestyle question. I think that extends to me, and I found this common ground in both your presentation, is the emphasis on context. That context really matters. And universalizing solutions is part of the problem because we land up using the wrong solutions because they become emblematic or symbolic of a gesture which is not actually effective but ticks off a box, right? And I mean, even the LEEDs and many of these sorts of codes, let's say, they were really chemical or mechanical fixes to problems. You made the dumbest glass box and then you could double insulate, you could do this, that, and the other. And now Greha and many other adaptations are actually contextual because they're saying for India what might be the right code. And I think we're moving towards that. So this idea of universalizing, what do standards mean, how do they get applied, is something we have to be critical about. I guess I got that. I think both of you implicitly really highlighted that. The third is the question of urban form, and you both sort of raised it because, Rajan, you said, the Haveli or the Koti worked because the fabric was such that it allowed it to work. The walls protected each other. It was much denser. The courtyard was a moment where you could adapt your lifestyle, as I was describing. And similarly, the context of even in the West, I think Paris, for example, the material on the roof is a problem, but otherwise the city, for other reasons, works quite well from this perspective. And, it's interesting, and this is something I discuss with my students a lot when we talk about housing. I mean, what has happened in the contemporary urban context is that if you think about it, in any city, all the cities we love and walk around in Europe and other parts of the world, Jaisalmer in India, it's 80% or 90% of the city is housing. And it's as a fabric, which means it's all background architecture, which means you walk down the streets, you'll notice a detail or two, but the fabric is pretty even. And it's low-key, it's background architecture, and then the church or an institution stands out as a foreground piece of architecture. What is happening in cities today is everything wants to be foreground architecture. So everything becomes autonomous, it twists and turns, it gets clad in glass. We have no fabric left in our cities, right? So which means then you begin to get autonomous objects that you have to deal with, and they don't work in synergy with each other, as in traditional towns we had an entire fabric, and the unit was, I think Jacqueline Robertson, who was Peter Eisenman's partner, he said in traditional towns around the world, they were like machines with different parts doing different functions. And then he said Houston has become a bunch of spare parts. It's just different parts thrown together. It doesn't form the machine. So that was an interesting kind of emblem of the problem. And I think in both your presentations, that comes out really starkly without you having said it. But the context really matters. And so that leads me to my last point, which is, I would hope, a question that you might reflect about, which is the idea of bridges. Urban design, the department I'm in, many of my students are here. We describe urban design as a bridge practice, which is that urban designers are architects who are familiar with the language of planners, and planning is two-dimensional, it's reports, it's abstract. And architecture is very site-specific because architects get a project, they put their blinkers on, they know what setbacks they have to do, how much FAR they have, and they build a building. So you get the building of the city of autonomous parts rather than the fabric. Urban designers are supposed to be advocates who say, my God, that policy is going to lead to this form, therefore let's change the policy so we get the right form. So in that spirit, Both of you alluded to the fact that we need to make these bridges. Rajan, you said that students must be taught to measure environment. Why don't they measure? Well, they measure drawings, make plans. You said that we need to advocate. What do you think is that way forward? What are the bridges we can make where we can change the form of the city? We can talk about cultures in different way. Where should we be advocating? And what are your reflections on that? And then we'll open it up.
I think my first reaction on the how do we bridge is, I think the number of players we have on a drawing board needs to increase. And I like your example where you say that each building wants to be autonomous, and hence you don't have a background or foreground. Everything becomes autonomous and isolated. I think that's where, in a practice also, architect needs to have many people on board. He or she only cannot really take all the decisions. The way we have started getting a structural engineer or an MEP engineer, now we have a building occupant consultant as well. Probably we also need to have a place for someone who can be a charge of energy, comfort, heat, stress, and make sure that all design decisions, whether it's at the building scale or it's a neighborhood scale or at the city scale, has been taken in consultation with someone who can own some of these problems. So that's one reflection. Second is the first point you talked about, a culture. I think, to me, and what we have seen along with the empirical data, especially in a cooling-dominated environment like India, is that, which is a little worrisome, is that addiction to a cooling. Even if I am comfortable, even if I am thermally comfortable, I would like to feel cool. So in our theory, we always have two questions, or rather, when we do some kind of work, we ask two questions to the people and said, "Are you comfortable?" And if they are comfortable, the second question is that, "Would you like to change anything?" And 80% of people said, "Yeah, I'm comfortable. I want to be cooler." That means the moment you get exposed to cooling at some point in time, you always seek that part. And that's where I think the culture probably is a little bit worrisome with the way we are heading up. Is where we, even if we don't need it, we would like to have it, kind of stuff. So that's a reflection from my side on too.
I mean, almost equivalent to luxury. It becomes a form of luxury.
Yeah, and some people say that it is a sign of feeling powerful. That I don't need it, but still I have it. That means I'm powerful. I mean, some of the people interpret it that way, and that's what it is.
Thank you. Gary?
Yeah, no, I feel like we're in a culture where, or at least in academia, people are always looking for information, comfortable with the need to have information, but there's no doubt there are avenues of collecting information that are still not encouraged, respected. And so, you hear a lot of people talk about the idea of bringing communities into the decision making, but and some people roll their eyes at that and think that's easier said than done. But I don't know if anybody's had the experience, if you've ever worked at a job where one of the systems, like a HR system or a billing or something, changed, like someone decided to use a different software, and you feel like the person who made the decision had never actually been a user of the software. Like this happens all the time, where there are people making decisions about what buildings look like or how communities are designed without having those communities at the table. And once again, I know that that can be easier said than done, but even I've been at a table with really, really smart people talking about really important public health issues, social issues, where I really do feel like most of the people at the table don't know what they don't know. And I'm not saying I'm the all-knowing person, but it's been situations where I've had a little peek into the blind spot that's at the table about related to how people make decisions, how people move through the world. A few days ago, somebody was having a discussion about cooling centers, and there are places where there are cooling centers operating with very few people sitting there, and that's because you don't necessarily understand the options that are open to the folks who might need the cooling center. And in the year 2026, there are lots of cool places that people might be able to access that are more attractive, easier to get to. So their friend network, a local store, a local food court, sometimes we have good intentions and we're not, we're designing for an actor, so to speak, that we don't understand, and so once again, people might think it's easier said than done, but I've seen some really bad mistakes made when there's that gap. And, I've seen those mistakes made in how research studies are designed. I've seen it made when people design a new housing development or when people design a social program, out of really good intention to meet a need and address a public health problem, but they don't understand the constraints of that community. They don't understand the decision-making that is all really logical within that community, and that leaves them vulnerable to making bad decisions.
Thank you. Let's open it up and we can come back to these questions. Yeah, if you would just introduce yourself, one line, and you go ahead.
Hi, thank you. A big thank you to this esteemed panel. My name is Saloni Dev. I'm a faculty of global health at the Tufts University School of Medicine. And part of my research focuses on, Part of my research focuses on understanding social determinants of mental health in informal settlements that was also touched upon, or commonly known as slums. And I'm curious to hear from the panelists about the implications of what was discussed today on slums and its residents, and also what are some specific ways in which we can advance research, both epidemiological research and interventional research in these settings.
I think there are some evidences are coming, at least from India, that heat stress does relate to domestic violence and even road rage kind of situations. I'm sure that the classical definition of thermal comfort does mention that it is a state of mind. One of the very few definition in scientific field which doesn't really deal with so much of quantification, and it say that what is thermal comfort? Thermal comfort is the state of mind. And the moment you start talking about state of mind, obviously the mental health would be one of the first one. But I think it would be important and it would be nice to look at both together. Yes, one would start looking at the affordable housing or informal housing at the same time, but the way we are seeing probably does the trigger or the long-term ailments are only because of the heat, and does that happen also in other sector or not? But I think it's an important question to ask. I know one of the very big philanthropy foundation in India did a quite deep study before deciding that where are they going to put money for next 5 years. And after probably a year and a half of a lot of research work, they decided to put money in two areas. One is heat stress and one is mental health. So that gives me some kind of insight that, oh yes, I think these are sort of both important part, at least in India. And I think that's a reflection I have for sure. Thanks.
I would say, so I don't have deep experience working in informal settlements, although I'm working with a postdoc now who's based in Nairobi, who's trying to get some studies off the ground. I think I've spent most of my career doing very quantitative research. I use, statistical models. I use sensors we design in the lab and things like this. The more time I spend doing that, the more I appreciate the value of more qualitative research. And, just in the last year, like I've studied public housing in Boston for 20 years. I led 2 focus groups last year at a site in Roslindale. And there were things that I learned there that I thought I knew. And so you have to be, if you're a researcher at heart, you have to be ready to reevaluate some of the details. So for me, it would be really getting some good information on how people experience heat in their daily lives and how do they currently cope. Because the thing is, bringing a solution from outer space is not going to be, the way to go. You have to really understand, there's a lot of lived experience in just the resilience that people already have. Also, the thing we all have to shed is the sort of the culture of deficit. Like we think of about an informal settlement as being a place without, and that has a lot of, obviously there are a lot of struggles, but some of these issues may be like, there may be, conditions there that allow for some cooling that you don't have in a traditional building. So you have to keep your eyes open for just, how do people currently experience the problem? How do they currently make decisions and start to map out early what they envision as ways to solve the problem? That's a better starting point than coming in with all this great experience you have in high-tech buildings and trying to adapt that to that setting.
Sajid, any reflections you might want to make with the work? Because it's pretty much maps on. Ishita, if you could. Sorry, as a moderator, I could intervene and ask you to.
Thank you. We've talked about the difficulty of this. I think even the quantification of the problem is an issue, right? We don't necessarily have the taxonomy for mapping and quantifying informal settlements, and then it becomes sort of very relevant in large parts of Africa and South Asia. So I think your question is bang on. Just building off what Gary and Dr. Rabel said. I think we have to be careful about, it's not how do I get air conditions into the slums, but what might actually work there. And so in our work at the Self-Employed Women's Association, their questions very simple. They said, look, we have limited resources. And, the Falana Development Bank is saying we should have white paint on the roof. The other guys are coming and saying we should have green roofs. The third folks are saying we should, punch a window and improve ventilation. How do we make this decision? Like, is there evidence that one works better than the others? And so, our little intervention there is to say, look, can we bring what science can offer to try and bring some evidence to this? And then sort of the logical policy ramifications of this is again, what has been talked about is, well, if you can demonstrate at scale that X intervention is better than Y, then can you start building it into the building codes and the guidelines, right? So the Prime Minister, Awas Yojana, which is the national scheme for affordable housing, has until now focused a lot on water and sanitation, understandably, as those have been sort of the issues. But is there a role here now to say that ventilation and thermal comfort should be as much of a priority? Ideally, this the great minds in the front of us would say how, like, the win would be passive design, right? Like, can we actually convince that? I mean, Rahul, for 10 years you've talked about how our imagination is limited by Shanghai, and development sort of in the global south is trying to ape exactly the photographs that Rajan showed, right? And why were these glass buildings sort of the code to go? So that would sort of...
Yeah, so which is to really, in the bylaws, for example, all the bylaws in, say, at least in South Asia, are premised on public health, but to the extent of sanitation and cross-ventilation. Now, that can be nuanced much more with other registers, which might be able to capture the kind of things that Rajan is talking about. So, sorry, there's a question there, and then Anuj. Yeah, go ahead. Anuj next.
My name is Mayuri, and I am a postdoc at Graduate School of Design. I have one question for Professor Rajan and one question for Gary. For Professor Raval, I have this question that we have seen that the climate action plans are more prescriptive in nature, that when you have a heat wave coming, you can do these 4 or 5 things. But should those climate action plans be more long-term with staggered horizons, that for the next 25 years we should focus on making buildings more efficient, both in terms of comfort and energy, and probably in 50 years making whole cities more comfortable instead of just buildings? And do you see that we can have those solutions in long term, like making a recommendation whether the cities should have bigger sprawl or should they be denser and trap more radiative heat in global south versus being more sprawled? So can these questions be answered for long-term solutions in climate action plans?
Yeah, I think that the 2 points from my side on this. One is that climate action plan for the cities are the documents which are very, very overarching. And if you have to translate that into brick and mortar, it's impossible. Including, from climate action plan to the codes and bylaws. And so this is where the bridge design, you do have a master plan, you do have a development regulations, and you have individual building plots, but you do require urban design, you do require local area plan, and so on and so forth. So I think while we have that 20-year vision climate plan, hoping that that climate plan is very robust and very well, and I am sure that there will be some reflection on that as well. But let's say we have a ideal climate action plan from a city. If one has to translate that on a day-to-day basis, so 25-year climate action plan, every 2 years what needs to happen, that doesn't happen right now. So at one scale, you have a smallest building and building codes and what you need to do at the passive strategies. At that scale, what's going to happen after 20? There's nothing in between. I think that's where I would say a lot of work needs to be done. And it has to be dynamic. The way I understand from my university, other colleagues, senior colleagues, that you can't have a fixed 2020 2050 plan. You work for 2027, 28, you change what's going to happen in 2035, then again work towards that with a larger vision in mind. But that doesn't really happen largely. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
For Gary, you had a second question, if you can quickly go, because we have...
So we know that there are hotspots of heat-related deaths. Do we have targeted policy measures for those areas? And I for one, do urban building simulations, and I have used spatially diverse data sets for buildings in those areas. And we also have data about how much energy use they have. So by collating all of that data, can we have neighborhood-specific action plans for heat stress, or do you think it is not possible?
So I think the unsatisfying answer, it sort of depends on the specifics. So I would say, the act of looking at temporal and spatial variability can be a very effective hypothesis generating, action designing effort, if you know what I mean. So for example, like in the city of Boston, if I had asthma hospitalizations characterized at the address level, I could identify the 10 large multifamily buildings that are responsible for the highest dollar amount in asthma claims at local hospitals or something like that. That might generate a specific action plan to sort of have a worst first kind of intervention and sort of deploy existing strategies like housing inspectors to sort of just examine what might be happening there. I think there is something to say about having region specific, depending on the size of the city, to sort of divide it up into a region up into places that have very specific action plans, because the infrastructure is different, the nature of how people move around the city, the demographics of the community. If you have a lot of seniors that aren't necessarily that mobile, it's not. I wouldn't call it a prescription for local plans or targeted action. It sort of depends on. It's a way to start and a way to sort of think about the why behind it. If it were, if you looked at spatial variability in air pollution related outcomes, then you sort of backtrack to the sources and try. Maybe there are sources that aren't well characterized. For heat, it might have to do with the fact that there's almost no green space in a community, that there are a lot of seniors in that space, or some other factor. I know that's also not a very satisfying answer, but that's how I think about it.
Anuj, and then we go ahead.
Hi, I'm Anuj Bhagwati. I work a little bit in cooling, a little bit in urban planning and governance. So first, thanks for some wonderful talks. I had a couple of comments. I guess one of them is that Rajan Bhai, you talked about density and how we need to increase it. But I think there is also some limit to how much we can increase density, whether it's mental health or whether it's cooling or heating. And in many of the cities in the map that, the maps that we've looked at, I think we've crossed the threshold of livability in terms of density. If you measure density in terms of people per area, which is the normal way of doing it, but some people at your university look at it differently. So anyway, I think that's one point that we have to, caveat the density bit, because otherwise you have too much black space, you have too low open space, you have too many other problems that come up with amenity crowding. I think that one other point was that we didn't really talk much about air quality besides temperature and humidity. And especially COVID has taught us that one does need to keep in mind ventilation, which, especially if you want to cool or heat, does have a huge energy impact. So that's also an important point, perhaps an important aspect of air quality to look at. Similarly, with the roof material, though metal roofs will heat up more, they will also cool off more at night. So there are buildings, depending on the place, where it's better to actually stay with the metal roof and not to have an insulated roof. Examples, Volkswagen's building in Pune, Infosys buildings, various ones in Bangalore, they found that they were better off removing the insulation rather than staying with it. So I think that one needs to look over it, look over this stuff over a time period, because as you go through seasons, if you lose the night cooling, then you do run into some problems also. So that's another aspect to look at. I think also with regard to the architecture, not looking at numbers, architecture, education, not looking at numbers, which is agreed a very big problem. The other problem we have is that the codes also don't look at numbers. So even though Griha might be context dependent. I think in most cases, they're still just checklists. And so you can have a platinum rated LEED building which performs much worse in terms of energy use, whether it's in any way you look at energy use or consumption, than a building that isn't actually so highly rated. So I think there is a fundamental flaw. And that's also the same problem with the cooling action in other plants. They don't have any feedback loop to look at any actual number and then adapt. And that's basically what one needs to take care of. Sorry for...
No, thank you. Those are very useful. Please.
Thank you, Christoph Reinhardt, MIT. Thank you for a set of really nice presentations. Really, if you talk about all the heat, it makes me thankful going out on a cold night tonight. So that's quite an accomplishment. What I really want to talk about is the one-way street that cooling adoption in the world has been. Basically, any place in the world. We started with the slaughterhouses in Chicago. Wall Street had cooling. Anywhere cooling has arrived, it has never gone away. And part of that diffusion is a lack of imagination, as we saw it. It's the cooling boxes that don't make any sense. But I think, Rajan, you and I, we talked about that in the past. I mean, it's partly also that the world is getting so hot that we need some active cooling sometime in the year. And when you have it, you use it. I mean, Gary, you talked about it, because it's kind of nice to be a little cooler when I'm hot. And so what are your thoughts on basically making the one-way street into a two-way street? Because that hasn't happened in the last 100 years.
No, our work on global cooling price was actually trying to deal with the same, that the kind of market we have, and if I give you a little bit of numbers, 70% of OEMs are based in one country, and out of that 70%, 90% are only with the two manufacturers. That means there's so much of inertia that even if you want to change your technology, it's almost impossible. Now, from that point, the global cooling price, at least what gave us, is not just a one technology, but quite a few technologies which are capable of providing a cooling at much lower energy and climate cost. So that refrigerant and electricity both. And I'm hopeful that they will come in the market over next 5 years, if not 2 years. What is very funny to observe is that technology exists, market exists. There is a political will to bring that, but there is a lack of institutional structure. The finance is also available, but there is institutional structure, and this institutional structure is very, very biased towards a kind of technology. At the highest level, so the way we put it is, and in my university, that the two things which generally gets talked about, one is traffic and one is the cooling. And we say that traffic is a global problem but needs to be solved locally. Cooling is also a global problem but needs to be solved globally, because one or two companies does not make air conditioner for India or Malaysia for Indonesia. They make it for very, very large. However, the kind of testing protocols which we have at the highest level do not allow other technologies to come in. And I'm sure that probably Anuj will vouch that the kind of work they are doing and kind of equipment which they are making has a lot of potential. And we are not saying that everywhere you need to reach to 24 degrees centigrade. Even if you give 29, 30 degrees centigrade with a lower humidity, you're fine. But our testing protocols does not allow, it wants all the technology to be tested at 24. So this is where we are finding some institutional challenge at the highest international level. It's not one country can solve it. It has to be 24 countries who are sitting in a committee has to agree upon that. And that's where I think things are not moving the way it should move in terms of time. Thank you.
So do you want to respond?
I'll just say the short answer is I have no idea how to do that. But I do think, like, if you, like, in certain business sectors, you could imagine a world where that dial was just slowly turned over some time. Like if you're talking about like commercial cooling that's provided in like a high rise in Manhattan, you could imagine, a slowly moving adjustment. I do think there's some, but I know you're talking about a bigger thing. But I've seen cases where, there's also, a step change. A forced step change people can adapt to. I've seen folks move from overheated apartments into properly heated, and all you get for a year are complaints that it's freezing in here, even though someone was moved from 78 to 72. But then, 2 years later, everyone has gotten used to that situation. So I don't. That's a tough question. Is the bottom line.
One last question. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for your time, everyone. My name is Sohini. I'm a architecture student at the GSD, and my question is less about the practice and more to you as educators. When Professor Mehrotra brought up the issue of luxury and comfort becoming synonymous, it made me think of Daniel Barber's After Comfort, and how he mentions in there that the new ambition of architecture should be to condition people to be uncomfortable. And you also brought up how I think the pedagogy of architecture fails to address how we design things. How do you think you could talk about changing the pedagogy and how you think as educators?
So I'll divide this into two parts. One is in India we call it undergrad architecture, and I think undergrad architecture education simply needs to emphasize that there is a field which every architect needs to be concerned about, should take that into the account, but they may not be able to deal with it. So for example, if I have to, the way we say about the structural designing, that, oh, you have some thumb rules available, if you're designing a space, you need to do A, B, C, D, but we also tell them that you will not be able to do this. You need to go to a structural engineer to get it designed. Same thing, probably for undergrad architecture students, is that you need to emphasize that there is a comfort, there is energy, there is climate, and these are the basic things which you need to deal with. But do not try to deal with on your own, because it's reasonably complex. You might not be able to do it best in a best of the manner. You need to rely on someone who is specialized for that. That's probably the one way of doing it. But while we do that, at the same time, we also need to have courses or postgrad courses which deals with a specialized energy, climate, and integration of technical part as well as spatial part. So MEP engineers and architects probably needs to understand what are the requirements and so forth. While we do all of these, I think I still will have a faith in first principles. That means that students must deal with at least two things. One is the equations on blackboard, and second is measurements on ground. One must be able to find by touching it, oh, this is 65 degrees centigrade and this is 25 degrees centigrade. Once we have that, we have a whole lot of other, what we really love is modeling tools and stuff like that, which can make things life much easier and develop a lot of scenarios. But I think postgrad students must address the first principles to start with. And I think that's probably the way we can move forward. Thanks.
Thank you. So thank you all for being here, and to the LMSI for organizing this. I think one of the nice things, just looking around the audience, is I see people from various schools at the university and elsewhere, and really that is the purpose of the LMSI, to become a platform to bring different parts of the university together, and no other topic is of greater relevance than what we are talking about. And so thank you both for sharing your insights. Thank you all for being here, and see you all soon. Thank you.